on to video number 2, reviewing The Kitchen Daughter. So now the bit that really really irritated me is a bit where Ginny's sister tricks her into seeing a psychiatrist. Her sister does this by giving Ginny an address for a lawyer, because Ginny really wants to see a lawyer to kind of get even with her sister over her sister's wanting to sell the house, the family home, and Ginny wants to stay there. She doesn't want it to be sold. So Ginny goes along thinking that she's seeing a lawyer, and in actual fact, her sister has tricked her, and Ginny is actually her sister is actually arranging an appointment for her to see a psychiatrist. Now, if that had happened to me, if someone had done that to me, I can never forgive them. I cannot forgive someone for doing that. You know, I can forgive people a lot. I'm quite forgiving for a lot of things, but I can never forgive someone for tricking me like that. I would lose all trust in them if someone did something as, you know, as something as bad as that. That is awful, particularly when it's like someone, a family member, someone like that. It's awful, and her sister should not have done that. That's really just horrible behaviour. Let me know what you think, but that is the utmost of horrible behaviour. You should not trick someone. It's just horrible. Makes me angry just reading it, and this is just fiction. Makes me angry. So yeah, let me know what you think. But if I was in Ginny's position, seriously, I would not forgive the sister at all. Yeah, I'm surprised actually that Ginny in the novel wasn't actually more angry, because she didn't actually appear that angry, which is a bit surprising. Even though obviously she was pissed off, but she didn't actually appear that angry. She's surprising, really. And she sees this psychiatrist. And then she does go along with it. You know, I would, if that had happened to me, I literally would have flipped out, I think. I would have probably said the F word and run out. I would have had some sort of meltdown. I would have been extremely angry. Things would have gone flying if that had happened with me. Seriously. I would not have just been sitting there blithely, you know, in front of a psychiatrist. Things would happen. I would be that pissed off. But yeah, Jenny sits down in front of the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says to, and the psychiatrist doesn't really kind of like quiz Ginny for that long. This is on page 173. So she doesn't really get to know Ginny that long, and it seems that on just a few sort of telltale sort of signs, she says, Ginny, it would be premature of me to diagnose you, she says, but just talking to you, I can see that you aren't meeting my eyes. That's a key symptom. And I'm thinking, yes, not making eye contact can be a symptom, but it's not the only symptom. And also, some autistic people do make eye contact, and it can be quite kind of like hit and miss. And sometimes the eye contact can be variable, like not making eye contact. And sometimes you can have times making eye contact, particularly if you've been told to make eye contact. And I've talked about this elsewhere, but I've always struggled with eye contact. But people have told me to make eye contact a lot growing up, and I did try to do it, but not very, you know, it's very distracting. In actual fact, I never really look people in the eyes properly, only people that I really trust and that I feel aren't threatening me, and I can only do it fleetingly, and I can only do it when I don't need to concentrate. But because I kind of force myself at times to try and look in their general direction, most of the time not actually at their eyes, kind of more at the nose or that kind of area, people would think I was making eye contact, but then at other times I was making poor eye contact, so it's kind of like hit and miss. So I'm just saying that an autistic, particularly in a formal environment, might be trying to make eye contact, and if they're making eye contact and do those things, you know, psychiatrists might not pick things up. But if they're not but people can not make eye contact for all sorts of reasons, and it doesn't always mean autism either. So I'm a little bit surprised. This seems a little bit kind of like not very thorough, if you ask me. I mean, it seems in this book that Ginny never actually receives a formal diagnosis of autism. She's given, I think, what you would call a provisional diagnosis, because the psychiatrist has basically come to the conclusion that because she's not looking in her eyes, that they're sure she must be autistic. I do think that's a diagnosis is a serious thing. And I'm very, very against self-diagnosis, by the way. We could talk about this in another video, because on Twitter there are lots of people who self-diagnose, and that makes me really angry, because it's like, sorry, I'm being quite blunt here, and I am stating my mind, so if people are watching this who are self-diagnosed, I apologise, but I am really against self-diagnosis, and I always have been, because I think that only a doctor and a specialist can give you a diagnosis, and if you haven't got that diagnosis, all you can say is that you think you have something. You may well have it, but if you haven't been properly assessed, it's still only provisional. In this case, Ginny, it looks like she really does have it, but she still hasn't been properly diagnosed, and I did feel that, I don't know what to think about that. I mean, it's only a novel, it's only fiction, we have to assume that Ginny did have the syndrome, or the likelihood is she does, based upon all the other evidence in the book. But of course, she hasn't been officially diagnosed. She's only, and a psychiatrist has kind of come to this on rather kind of tenuous reason. So I'm not sure what to make of that. And I do think it's a bit of a stereotype as well about the eye contact thing. And the other thing that the thing that particularly irritates me here is that on page 176, the psychiatrist recommends behavioural modification to train Ginny out of certain behaviours. So she says, if you accommodate too much, the person's behaviours become part of their fabric. She said, you can allow them to have tantrums whenever they want, or you can teach them that a tantrum can't get them a desired goal. And this really pissed me off, because first of all, when an autistic has an explosion, it is not a tantrum. A tantrum is what typical children have tantrums. It's a developmental phase, the terrible twos. It's normal behaviour for little children to have tantrums. That is a tantrum. But if someone carries on having outbursts after a certain age, and it's developmentally inappropriate, there's usually some kind of reason for that. Because typically someone wouldn't still be having outbursts after a certain age. And in autism, there is a specific reason for it, because it's often to do with being overloaded or not being able to express yourself in any other way, because you struggle to express stuff or to regulate yourself. So it's not something you can really control. Obviously, there are strategies you can use to try and prevent them from happening, obviously, and other people can help, but it's not a case of trying to train a person not to have them through behavioural modification, which is what this psychiatrist is indicating, as though the person somehow has choice over them when they don't, when actually they're actually a biological mechanism going on in the brain. So this really angered me that the psychiatrist said this in this book, when they're not tantrums anyway, and it's not about getting a desired goal, though, is it? Because the person's overwhelmed. Your person's beyond reasoning with. It's to do with the brain misfiring. It's completely different to a toddler tantrum. It's completely different, and that really angered me. But let me know what you think, because that part of the book really pissed me off, and I thought it was kind of rather poor research on the author's part that she put this in the book. And the other thing that annoyed me is that the psychiatrist implied that people with Asperger's, because they can express themselves in words, that they have more ways to deal with their aversions, adults, their interests against other autistics. And that again is really binary and simplistic, because just because you have words and are highly verbal, that doesn't mean that you can necessarily express yourself in terms of you might be able to express yourself very well and very eloquently, say, when you're not stressed and in certain circumstances, but if you're say in a highly emotional situation and you literally are in that state of overload and having that explosion, you're not really in a place to be able to necessarily express yourself. Language might not be available to you at that time. So that just seemed a very overly simplistic binary way of separating different types of autism, which isn't actually accurate. And also the implication being that someone with Asperger's can become very successful as well. Now, I've talked about elsewhere how, personally, I don't 100% fit the Asperger's profile anyway, because I do struggle quite a lot more significantly, I think, than a lot of people with Asperger's with, say, routines, rigidities, and my social difficulties. So I'm kind of in a way straddling a profile, really. I'm not quite Asperger's. I don't completely identify with it. The only part of Asperger's that really fits in me is the high verbal. But I don't think that being highly verbal necessarily is an indicator of how successful a person can be. And by success, I don't mean that the person can't be successful. I mean, I could be successful in the kitchen. I'm talking about success in a more generic kind of the way that is used in society. Yeah, in inverted commas. She seemed to have this very binary spectrum approach, and the other thing is I don't really 100% agree with the idea of a spectrum, but that will take a whole other video, because I do think it's rather binary. She implied that someone with Asperger's wouldn't, say, throw a plate when they're upset, for example. That's not true. Seriously, people with Asperger's can throw plates when they're upset. So that was the main gripe I had with the book. Really. And the other issue was that her syndrome, or rather her difficulties, were kept a secret from her as she was growing up. I think she regrets that, that this hadn't been brought to her attention earlier. It's like her parents wanted to protect her from it because I guess her parents were wary about putting a label on her. But that can actually cause more damage than good in the long run, actually. Because she finds out that her dad had the syndrome. Again, I'm not sure if her dad was diagnosed or whether it's just an implication, but he said that he had the same, when his ghost appeared, he said that he had the same problems as her. And he found a way to succeed anyway, the implication being that so can anyone. And again, but I don't like that narrative because actually autism affects people in very different ways. And that rose-tinted narrative does overlook the fact that autism is actually a disability. I know there are some people who would disagree, and there are some people who seem to cope quite successfully and achieve things. But I do think that they probably have more of like an autistic personality as opposed to autism proper, because I do think autism proper is always a disability. But I know that's a controversial thing to say, but I do think it is, because otherwise I think it just dumbs down the whole concept, and it should be seen as a severe and obviously there are degrees of severity within that, but I do think that autism is always quite severe, no matter what type you have. And some have it more severe than others, obviously. There are degrees of severity. I mean, I'm not as severe as some people, some are really severe, and but I'm still severely affected. Because it's a disability and it does stop you living. And I do think that people who are very successful have more of an autistic personality. Because that is quite controversial, but I do strongly believe that. But yeah, Ginny is successful in her own way. She's successful in the kitchen with her cooking. She's very adventurous in the kitchen with her cooking. And that's interesting because although she doesn't really get out and about, she's a hermit, a bit like me. She spends all her time in the kitchen. She's incredibly adventurous, in terms of like her cooking. But she doesn't really adventure outside. But inside she's adventurous with her cooking, and I can relate to that because I'm adventurous in my cooking, but I'm not adventurous outside. Because it's of interest, you see. When you're interested in something, you can experiment and you've got that motivation. But it does have a positive message, that what is normal, and obviously, you can be normal. Ginny's normal. What is normal at the end of the day? Just because you're disabled and struggle doesn't mean you're not normal. It's just a different type of normal. It's not a bad thing at all. Being disabled isn't a bad thing. We need to remove that stigma. I think, there's nothing shameful about it, it's just a state of humanity. The fact that the word normal should be seen as a more inclusive word, and Ginny starts to realise, maybe she can live in a world of who she wants to be after all, and she starts to come out of denial, so that's a positive thing, that she does eventually come to accept her difference, and maybe eventually she will get that formal diagnosis. Obviously we don't know because the book comes to an end. But it is quite, at the end, she actually does cook a Thanksgiving, because this is set in America. She actually cooks a Thanksgiving dinner for her sister. So it kind of, her sister then is at the receiving end of Ginny's hospitality. So, it does show her as actually being pretty capable after all, really, in that area at least. Ginny does start to sort of express herself as well, that about, from her own point of view, that Amanda, her sister, isn't really thinking about how much protection can feel like imprisonment. So, because Ginny's been overly coddled by her sister, and before that her mother, that they're not seeing things from Ginny's perspective. So it's kind of that double empathy problem kind of thing. Yes, Ginny struggles with the empathy side, but then so do her sister. It's a two-way street, really. Non-autistics can struggle to understand the autistic perspective. And obviously Amanda's very much in denial about her daughter as well being autistic, because she thinks that Ginny's saying her daughter is broken, and that's because Amanda has this very negative view about autism as well. As I say, it looks like towards the end that Ginny and her sister start to come to some kind of resolution, and that maybe her sister starts to see that actually Ginny isn't broken, that Ginny is normal in her own unique way. So that's a positive development, I think, and that's what I liked about the book. It did seem to show how, it's not a bad thing, being different. Obviously it makes life hard, but it's not intrinsically a bad thing in the sense that a person isn't broken, So, anyhow, so I'm going to finish now, and do let me know what you think. So, thank you for watching.